Good morning, everybody who's listening and watching us from all over the world. My name is Daniel Lutaya, and welcome to this virtual press conference. We are coming to you live from Uganda at the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, CIATINI. And we first of all apologize for starting a little bit late by a few minutes. We hope that we'll be able to catch up with those minutes when we have our conversation. Today's theme is promoting equitable, transformative, and mutually beneficial EU-Africa trade relations in the era of emerging sustainability directives. Remember, the European Union is one of Africa's largest trading partners, and some statistics even put the EU above the US and China when it comes to trade in certain products, especially imports coming from Africa to the European Union. And today we want to understand what new regulations are in place and what they could mean for the economics in African countries, but also what it means for the trade going on, the trade that sustains many of our countries. And we shall be having Q&A, so even those that are listening who are not part of the moderators, part of the panel rather, you will be having an opportunity to speak on this virtual press conference and also ask questions. So for the journalists all over the world who are listening and watching, you'll have an opportunity later on to ask questions to my panel. We shall also have a panel discussion, like I said, a Q&A session, and we'll have opening remarks and framing of the conversation. So right now, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI, Ms. Jane Nalunga, to give us, to frame the conversation of what we are going to talk about, and also to give us the background such that we have a base and a foundation where to start our conversation from, and such that even those who maybe just meandered upon this link somewhere on Twitter or Facebook can understand what we are talking about. You're welcome, Ms. Jane.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching. You are most welcome to this. I would like to welcome our listeners, to welcome the fourth estate. The fourth estate is really, really important, to put all these issues in the public domain. I also like to welcome our speakers. Our speakers have been drawn from a diverse field. We have our speakers from the academia. My good friend, Dr. Christian, he's a fellow in the World Trade Institute in the University of Bern. We have the civil society, my friend Rangalira Nechemeza from the CIATINI office in Southern Africa, based in Zimbabwe. We also have the Cocoa and Coffee Farmers Network, Ms. Ashley Tatoman. We also have civil society, but from also an ecofeminist point of view, my friend Lucy Nyambura. So we have that diverse field of speakers, but they're also drawn from the EU and also from Africa, So we are going to have that diverse conversation and diverse perspective from different fields, but also from the global north, from the European Union, and also from Africa. And this is really, really important so that we have a 360 degrees analysis of this issue. This conversation is really timely and very critical especially for African economies. Why? One, the EU has put in place a number of sustainability directives, and the speakers will talk about it, explain this issue deeper. Under the EU Green Deal. In fact, under the EU Green Deal, there is a mixed bag of over 50 regulations and directives. But for today, this conversation is also very critical because one of those directives, the European Union Deforestation Regulation, imposes a deadline of 30th December. But for people who know trade, when you say 30th December, that all products entering EU, coffee, cocoa, and other products must comply to this directive. It means private sector has to buy, their products before that. So the deadline really, even if on paper it's 30th December, it's not. It's really looming. It's a looming deadline, and this has put an immense pressure, financial, even emotional, on governments to comply. But there is also fear, especially on the most vulnerable, the small-scale farmers, whether they will be able to continue trading. So there is that. People are in turmoil. So we need to. That's why we need to have this conversation. But these directives are also coming at against a background of global economic uncertainty. All of us, we know about the tariffs. A number of tariffs are being imposed on African countries, and all these issues are imposing a very, very, very big challenge on our economies. What I want to state, is that the stated intentions behind the Global Green Deal are noble, they are critical, because they are looking at addressing the climate crisis. And climate is a global good. But the application should not be punitive, and adequate resources should be provided. But I also want to underscore the fact that the European Union, through a number of development partners, has been able to provide resources to a number of governments. Our government here in Uganda, the European Union has been able to provide resources, but they are not enough. We appreciate the resources, but they are not enough given the remaining time and given what compliance means, what needs to be done to be fully compliant. Governments need technical, financial support, information, so a lot of resources are really needed. So I would like to end my short presentation, opening remarks, with talking about the objectives of this conversation. The major objective of this conversation is to have a deep understanding and appreciation of Africa's concerns around all these directives, but we also need to look at the opportunities in these directives, and there are opportunities there, so we need to bring them out, to understand them and appreciate them. Two, we need to interrogate how these sustainability goals can be aligned to Africa's development priorities, because we need to comply, we need to comply, but how do we relate them so that the sustainability goals move in line with as Africa, our development goals. Lastly, I hope by the end of this conversation, we would have generated concrete recommendations on how we can be able to promote an equitable, transformative, and mutually beneficial EU-Africa trade relation. For me, that's my hope, that we can be able to do that, generate concrete recommendation. Daniel, I think I will stop there. I wish us all fruitful deliberations, and thank you once again for joining this conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Jane Nalunga. Now, our work has been cut out for us. 3 words: equitable, transformative, and mutually beneficial. And I think the debate is on the mutually beneficial, because you did talk about Africa's concerns. There are opportunities that you have not told us, but she is part of the panel, and I'll be asking those questions about the opportunities. And I think one of the biggest debates that I have seen around this topic is sustainability versus our development goals as African countries. And that's something that she has also noted. Now, let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Ashley Tattleman. And if I pronounce anyone's name wrongly, please forgive me. I am my English is influenced by my traditional language here in Uganda, Luganda, and therefore I may pronounce certain names that are not from Africa differently. But please pronounce your name correctly when I give you an opportunity to speak, such that we can all learn how to pronounce it. Ashley Tattleman has spent the last 15 years working to advance equity and power redistribution across agriculture value chains, and her work spans African, Latin American, and Asian farming communities that are producing coffee, cocoa, and horticultural products, from field level engagement to entrepreneurship for value addition in East African origins to policy advocacy in Brussels. Ashley's systems thinking approach bridges grassroots realities and practical business experiences and global social, political, and historical context. Ashley currently serves as the global coffee lead at Vocal, which is Voice of Organizations in Coffee Alliance Network. It's a civil society coalition united to achieve a sustainable and just coffee sector. She holds a master's degree in international development from the New School, where she deepened her commitment to social, political, and economic justice, human-centered design, and decolonizing development. Her Bachelor of Arts in International Business and Psychology is from Chapman University. Welcome, Ashley, and if you can hear me, Ashley, please say hello to our listeners and our viewers.
Yes, good morning, good day, good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, and it is with great pleasure and humility that I join this panel and discussion today. I very much look forward to engaging with you all, and looking forward to hearing also from so many interesting speakers. Thank you, Daniel.
I also hope that I did not completely destroy your name, your second name.
No, you did phenomenal. Your English is perfect. I think you do not need to give any caveats about your linguistic skills, sir.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Next, I'll introduce Ruth Nyambura. Ruth is a Kenyan feminist and activist scholar. Her work is on the intersections of gender, economy, and ecology. For the last 13 years, Nyambura has worked within the environmental justice movement spaces in Africa and with the wider global South majority. She's a researcher, popular political educator, cultural worker, and more recently, a grant maker. She's also a board member of the Blue Planet Project, BPP, an organization that focuses on water justice struggles in the global South, as well as an editorial member of the Ecofeminist Collective at the capitalist Nature Socialism, that is CNS journal. Nyambura is a writer. She's written extensively on various aspects of the current agrarian transformations in Africa, with her overall work focusing on the ideological underpinnings of the post-colonial agrarian environment development policies in Africa and how they are inscribed and transformed by specific global macroeconomic policies and, importantly, their nexus or connection with the afterlives of the center core periphery historical configurations. Her organizing work is guided by a politic anchored on the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialistic, intellectual, and organizing histories of liberation in Africa. Nyambura convenes Ramani Collective, which is formerly the African Ecofeminist Collective. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Communication from Daystar University, Kenya, and a Master's in Cooperative Law, Economics, and Finance from the University of Turin, Italy. Finally, Nyambura is beginning her doctoral research at the University of Liège, Belgium, Faculty of Law, focusing on the regulatory regimes of accumulation concerning seed privatization laws across Africa. Welcome, Ruth Nyambura, and let's hear from her. Please say hello to our listeners and our viewers.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to join you. Jane, it's such a beauty to see you after very many years. And I look forward to the conversation. I believe I'm in such great company. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Christian Habeli, with a PhD about African investment law. He's a fellow at the World Trade Institute, that is World WTI, the University of Bern, and a consultant for scientific research and outreach activities in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and in the Americas too. Over 80 publications in multilateral, regional, and preferential trade and investment issues related to climate change, agriculture, food, security, and food safety, obesity and malnutrition, environment, human rights, employment and labor rights, ethics and theology, WTO accession, and equitable trade. His professional career started in Madagascar, Thailand, and Nepal between 1978 and 1986. The trade negotiator for Switzerland in the GATT and the WTO during the Uruguay and Doha rounds, which was 1986 to 2007. The chair of the Joint Committee of the Agricultural Agreement of Switzerland and the European Union of 2002 to 2007, also chair of the WTO Committee on Agriculture regular sessions between 2005 and 2007, and special expertise and practice as an adjudicator in trade dispute settlement between 1986 and 2024. Christian has been dealing with trade since before I was born. So I want to hear from Christian. It's amazing to have all this knowledge in one place. Christian, please say hello to our listeners.
Good morning, and thank you so much, colleagues and friends, for introducing me with such a long CV, which means indeed I might be the oldest person around here. I would just add one detail from my past. I was maybe also in East Africa before you, because my first visit it dates back to 1971. So I'm an old fellow, even as a visitor to and resident in Africa. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll also have Mr. Rangarirai Machemedze, the coordinator Siatini, Southern Africa on trade and development, a trade and development expert, and he'll be joining later. And when he joins, I'll let you know. But we also have Miss Jane Malunga here, who will also, if I have a lot of questions, I will direct them to her, especially for
those are experts.
She will help us get the to make me understand, because I don't want to assume that I'm an expert in any of these things. I only know how to speak and do a little bit of research. Okay, let's get into the conversation. Yes, and to drink the coffee and the chocolate. I like it, but I really have, and I think I speak for many of us, that we have very little idea about how that coffee actually gets to our cups wherever we are in different countries all over the world. So I'll start with you, Dr. Christian. We would love to understand the EUDR, which is the European Union Deforestation Regulation, because that is one of the burning issues that has come up with discussions around the European Union and Africa's trade policies. So what exactly is this EU Deforestation Regulation, and how is it then going to change, or how is it changing how we do trade between these two continents?
Thank you very much. Let me start with congratulations. I think this is the perfect timing for placing a milestone for Uganda and Tanzania. And my student Shruti, also present here, Shruti Shanvar, has called it continental strength. You are the leader, can be a leader in this new movement and new initiatives. I would like to add the AFCFTA, which is a possibility to negotiate trade concessions as a bargaining power of all the African Union member states which have negotiated, ratified the AFCFTA. By fixing standards within intra-African trade, for instance, by avoiding export restrictions and import SPS prohibitions for maize, which is the biggest traded food item for intra-African trade, but is hampered by lots of non-tariff measures, non-tariff barriers, and this AFCFTA can take the lead in this new movement when you have to negotiate with the big guys outside Africa. So co-developing standards is a possibility. Traceability, transparency, we'll talk about that later today. The green supply chains, decision shaping, co-shaping by African stakeholders in the Green Deal impact on the continent, which is what we have as a topic today. And I'd like to add also what Shruti told me. The EU must not be allowed, and they cannot let climate action impoverish Africa, which is holding critical minerals and carbon sinks for its main trading partner. So this is the perfect matchmaking operation we can instigate with this exercise. Before I come to the EUDR, I would like to insist on one thing. We have to always separate the objectives and the measures, implementation measures. I will now start first with implementation measures. We have a Green Deal, which is a bunch of 50 different regulations and directives. And they're all unilateral. Deforestation, to give you one example, which we come to now, has been negotiated intra-EU between the Commission and the two only member states which produce logs in substantial export quantities. The two countries are Sweden and Finland, and my Finnish colleague from MATS, which Jane knows very well, she told me that they had to negotiate for 10 years with the Commission to define deforestation. Yeah, never mind what other countries call deforestation, or the FAO or the UN or whatever. So self-defined unilateral standards are definitely not the right way to go when you have an impact on third countries. So it's not only on third countries, it's also the big problem of SMEs, which my fellow speakers will talk about. We have a quagmire, we have a conundrum of so many different data which have to be collected before an SME, a small and medium enterprise, can become operative and exporting to Europe. Lo and behold, the EU has made sure that their own SMEs are not hit by those measures. They can continue to import their usual small quantities and without having to register each in Ghana and so on and so forth. So this is not the case for SME producers in Africa or in Asia or in other countries. They have to comply, and there so far has been no movement from the EU to say that they can have some leeway or some time frame and all this sort of thing. So the EU did not consider this thing. The same for CBAM. CBAM we won't talk much perhaps today, but CBAM also is the choice of products, which products are in, which products are not in. For instance, why is agriculture not in the CBAM? That's nothing to do with coffee producers in Africa. It's just their own farmers in the EU and the complicated CAP, which is a big mess, as we know, which refuse to submit agriculture to carbon costing. Yeah. So we have all these selective, self-defined unilateral measures, which then for lawyers like myself, it is easy to take to the WTO and say what is illegal, incompatible with WTO obligations. But what I would like more insist on today is the EPA regulations and procedures, the processing EPAs, which allows African countries to make their views, including for their SMEs, known in the TSD chapters of those agreements, they're in sustainable development, or discuss in the WTO, to establish this green lane, what Jane was referring to, right? So this way of formulating measures by the EU is highly critical, highly complicated, and controversial. And that's where now I would like to talk of the objectives before I come to your options. So the objectives are, I think, the same for everybody. We have the Paris Climate Agreement, which everybody has, almost everybody except President Trump, has ratified. But we have special differentiated treatment in these agreements. It's not SDT like we call it in WTO. It's CBDR, as you know, co-responsible. We have the SDGs as overarching goals, which can be measured with implementations, with scales, with reports. All of the SDGs, not just 12. For me, for food, SDG 2 would be very important anyhow. So this gives the non-developed countries a differentiation possibility, which is enshrined in that agreement of the Paris Climate Convention, right? And this now leads me to see what can you do with the assets you have from those agreements. So the choices for Africa are to nail down the EU on their obligations, for instance, for trade facilitation, something which nobody so far seems to acknowledge in Brussels, that the EU has signed not only the WTO agreement on trade facilitation, it also has it enshrined in their EPAs, and not least in what the customs procedures involve. You know, when you come to customers as a tourist, you come to a green or orange or nothing to declare lane, and you will be let through or not, whatever. But even more important, when your container arrives in Rotterdam, when you're a trusted trader, you get the green lane, and if not, you get more inspections, more supervisions and monitoring, this sort of thing. So the same will apply to the EUDR implementation. But this link between what the EUDR small script now is providing for the implementation for SMEs especially in the mid of 26, that has not been yet linked with the trade facilitation obligations which the EU itself has in its WTO and its EPA commitments. So this is something which you can use. And let me take 2 examples from carbon costing, which is a nightmare, a CBAM, yeah, before I come back to EUDR. South Africa, as we speak, is trying to negotiate an EPA with the EU. And they are in a hurry. They want to get something done by the end of the year, both Brussels and South Africa. And lo and behold, of course, this involves carbon costing. And it involves in avoiding CBAM taxes to be paid by African exporters just because they use coal or whatever to make their food or non-food exports for Europe. So they're negotiating a no CBAM clause in their EPA, in their trade agreement with the European Union. And so far as we see from Geneva, at least, South Africa has not started legal action against the EU for CBAM. Then you have the special cases, again, on CBAM. Everybody knows the Mozambique case and the Moroccan case for phosphates, Mozambique for lithium and others. They have to get a special deal. It is quite clear to everybody, which will make CBAM circumstantiated to countries and to products and to operators, and that will be involving commitment. These countries will have to take commitments for monitoring, for instance, and they will have to register that that's my suggestion at least, they should register that in their national development, the NDC, under the Paris Agreement. If they can commit there, that is something which can be monitored under the Paris Agreement, again, with differentiated responsibilities. So I did also mention in my mail to Jane and Ashley the possibility of trade debt for nature. That's something which we can do better also, but it's not a topic for today maybe. But there are many African choices in those ways which are different from European or Asian or whatever choices. The keyword, you want me to stop? Okay, I'll finish with one keyword, and that's equivalence. Do not look for identical measures, look for equivalent measures, taking into account CSR participation, joint financing of climate smart investment, and then the operators will have to take very painful decisions. Do I want to keep up with the new standards negotiated with the EU, or do I have to look for alternative markets which do not ask questions in Asia, in America, which do not ask sustainability questions for my export? This is a very painful decision, but again, AFCFTA is there to have harmonized, and that includes that improves the bargaining position of each African country. I have closed for now. Looking forward to this debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian. I want to bring in Ashley because Ashley deals with smallholder farmers at the ground level, and I want you to give us experiences from the ground on how these the sustainability directives of the European Union are affecting farmers at the ground level. What are you hearing from these smallholder farmers all over Africa? What are they saying about how this is affecting their bottom line, their livelihoods?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That's a very good question. Just briefly to speak about, to give a context of Vocal Network. I represent the Vocal Network, which is a coalition of civil society members, mostly now located in the global north, but we are a new organization and we would love Siatini and others, maybe even here as panelists to join, can also decolonize the civil society space and ensure that everyone's voices who are interested in the coffee sector are represented. Our sister organization is the Voice Network, which has been around for the last 15 years and focuses on sustainability in the cocoa sector and is very active in West Africa. So from a coffee perspective, very focused on East Africa, and a little bit of representation from our Voice Network with cocoa in West Africa. That's kind of where some of my positions are coming from. I'd like to briefly acknowledge that both of our organizations, Vocal and Voice, although I'm here primarily representing Vocal, are interested in 4 aspects of what we call sustainability in the cocoa and the coffee supply chains and sectors. First is to really recognize that we are in a context where we need to further decolonize trade and policy environment. So we are working in that historical context, and we fully acknowledge that while trying to ensure that those who are in the worst circumstances are not left behind. And what we mean by that is we focus, secondly, on equitable value and risk distribution. We think about that from a value chain perspective, as well as from a global inequality perspective. And that means that we look at achieving a living income for all, as well as corporate accountability. And finally, we're interested in the 2 issues around responsible environmental stewardship and the protection of human rights. So that's the context that we're coming from. Now, when we speak to smallholder farmers, and especially civil society agents that represent those smallholder farmers, so both of those tiers across East and West Africa, we see 2 different trajectories. One trajectory is that smallholder farmers are being linked to compliance measures. This is mostly in the context of countries and sectors that are well organized, where the public, private, and civil society have come together. So we see, for example, in Uganda, that around half of the smallholder farmers in coffee are actually compliant and ready for EUDR and will not lose market access. We also see West African farmers who are also smallholder farmers in cacao, for example, compliant because they are working with the governments and with many actors in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana especially, who have been preparing for multiple years. So we see with the EU cocoa talks in West Africa, and then in the example in Uganda of the National Task Force for EUDR, for example, that there have been collaborative actions that have been funded and supported by EU actors to enable preparation and compliance. Now, what I can say is that there is an inequality and inequity in who is accessing these resources and who is ready for compliance. Now, what we see across the board is that those who are compliant are the ones that are usually larger farmers or farmers that are part of more formal and I would say even certified farming groups. So these are shorter supply chains that rely on certification and organized farmer groups, and that do typically export with multinationals or work with exporters who are linked to European headquartered businesses because they are larger, they have economies of scale, and they tend to have their own data systems already. And they know, at least for their direct supply chains, who they're sourcing from. So we see that farmers who are already in more structured supply chains that are shorter are benefiting from the actual target of the EU directives, which is multinational and European-based investment in traceability to ensure that these markets are traceable. Those farmers are going to continue having access to the high value, reliable market of the European Union. On the flip side, we also know that many of these supply chains are very opaque. They are long. There are many actors in the supply chains between the exporter and the smallholder farmer. Now, this significantly varies country by country and commodity by commodity, in part based on how the structure of industry is organized. Take a look at in East Africa, for example, when you have the coffee sector in Rwanda, which is highly structured. I spent 5 years in Rwanda working in coffee. So it's a highly structured supply chain and model compared to, which is much easier to trace and build traceability systems, as well as central data management. And then if you look at Uganda, which is also still making great progress, but a very liberalized market with long supply chains, there we see that even though Uganda has been making progress since 2023 in moving towards compliance for EUDR and CSDDD, that at least half or roughly half, a third to a half of farmers are still not connected. So there is certainly fear of exclusion from European markets. I should be clear that smallholder farmers who are not compliant for the EU directives, EUDR, and otherwise will not lose all market access for selling their coffee, cocoa, or other crops. However, they may lose access in the short to medium term while they are not compliant to those high value markets in the EU. I have several other things to say, but I think that this answers to some degree your question on how farmers are faring. I would like to also highlight that there is, I think I already kind of mentioned, that we do see some inequity and differences in the preparation of also local actors. So I think we want to talk about the risk of marginalizing and excluding smallholder farmers. But we also, as Christian also highlighted, we want to mention the difference or asymmetry between the preparedness of multinationals and the preparedness of multiple local actors, be it producers, but also middlemen, traders, processors, and local exporters who cannot benefit from economies of scale to the same degree that multinationals can, and probably are not resourced or prepared from a technological and data perspective in order to prepare. I do have quite a few comments on opportunities here, but that was not the question that you asked. So I'm going to respect the moderator and the question that was asked of me and leave it there. But I hope to circle back to talk a little bit more about the opportunities here. as I do think that there are quite some in order for us to at least work towards ensuring that these processes are more equitable for smallholders and local actors. But back to you for now, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And indeed, we're going to talk about the opportunities a little later. I want to bring in Ruth to just ask about the intersection of the ecological justice and gender equity. How does this then become a gender issue? But also, two of the speakers have talked about the marginalization. Looks like African voices or grassroots voices, to be exact, have been sidelined when it comes to the creation of these policies on trade by the European Union. But how does that look like from your point of view? How does that marginalization, how has it manifested? If you could explain to us how it has been, if you believe indeed that there has been marginalization, that is, Ruth.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the two speakers before me. Actually, my answer to the question will largely do more in terms of out what the first two speakers have already spoken about. And I want to start, I like to do historical work, right? So it's important to contextualize the present moment in the context of marginalization. Africa is not an empty canvas. It's important to begin with that. Trade has never been neutral. It is a site that is heavily contested historically and politically, established during the colonial era, and still largely reflects those power dynamics between the European Union, between Africa, but basically between the global north or global minority and the global south/global majority. So it's important to begin with that. We are not talking about trade as a neutral site. It is a site that is deeply contested. It is a site of multiple and intersecting inequalities that have been with us for hundreds of years, since the colonial encounter across the continent of Africa. And my work largely is within the context of food systems produce about 70 to 90% of the food that is eaten on this continent, right? Even while under legal and regulatory attack from, for example, heavily criminalizing seed-related laws, but also the compliance regulations that we are seeing coming from the European Union. In addition to that, and continuing with the politics of historicizing the moment, but also thinking about multiple and intersecting inequalities and marginalization. In the last 50 years, the whole continent of Africa has had to face structural adjustment programs in the context of the politics of neoliberal globalization, where the state and state investments have retreated. Smallholder farmers, peasant farmers, and businesses, and especially within the context of agriculture, which is really uniquely gendered, because largely the food that we eat on the continent, the labor around agriculture and the agricultural value chains is by African women, many of them poor and working class, many of them existing in rural areas across the continent of Africa, rural areas that continue to be marginalized by the state in the context of development. So the last 50 years, the retreat of state investment has meant that, this idea that the rules around the EU around emissions, that they will magically, these smallholder farmers, for example, across Africa, that they will magically be able to comply is actually an insult to the real structural crisis facing the majority of both the rural poor and working class across Africa and the wider global south. So for myself and the movement spaces that exist in the feminist movements, the women's movements, the agricultural movements, the peasant movements, the farmers' movements, it's important to begin this conversation, not just from the point of we have different regulatory, directives emerging from the European Union, right? But rather to start with, what is the template? What is the canvas that exists across the continent of Africa, where you have 50 years of state neglect, and not just state neglect, right? When you look at the fact that neoliberal globalization has largely supported the businesses, the corporations within the global global north and also the European Union. So the marginalization of African farmers, the marginalization of African businesses, the fact that as a continent in Africa, we still only have about or own about 3% of the manufacturing capabilities across the world, yet a lot of the resources that are used in the context of manufacturing and industrialization across the world, and especially within the global north, are from the continent of Africa. So you begin to see the forms of marginalization, the gendered aspects of them, but also the class aspects of these forms of marginalization within the context of trade and the historical trade policies across the continent of Africa. So specifically around this specific rules and compliance initiatives by the EU, they disproportionately burden smallholder farmers, again, mostly women, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, as the previous speaker has spoken about, the compliance thresholds favor, for example, larger farms connected to, agribusiness corporations within the global north. Bigger companies, for example, are able to take advantage of this economies of scale when it comes to regulation and financing that smaller companies, small and medium-sized companies, and smallholder farmers, who are the majority across the continent of Africa, are not able to exploit or take advantage of. One, because, of course, as I've already spoken about, 50 years of the structural adjustment program, where the state has largely neglected small and medium-sized enterprises and also all but fully neglected smallholder farmers. So under CBAM, for example, right? These farmers and small businesses quite simply will not be able to compete in the market, thereby creating new fronts of inequalities and dispossession. Again, going back to the fact that the regulations that are currently being imposed by the EU, as we said, the continent of Africa is not an empty canvas. There are already existing multiple existing inequalities that already favor the global north and the EU, and this new regulation threaten to basically deepen the deep structural inequalities that we already exist. Under CBAM, for example, specifically the tariff on carbon-intensive imports, the argument that we're hearing is that the mechanism will help to drive corporate investments into decarbonization in the EU's trade partners. But the financial incentives to boost corporate investments, right, and even investments at the small, medium-sized scale for developing countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change remain very, very limited. In fact, those of us who regularly follow negotiations within the UNFCCC, the EU, the global north, has been very, very horrible in the context of actually providing climate finance. So climate finance, for example, has largely been a mirage in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years of, because this year's COP30, the last 30 years of negotiations around climate finance, but also investments. So what's going to magically change around this particular investments when they tell us that they will support investments, but also they will work in the context of reducing carbon emissions, but also to specifically speak about climate change, because the narrative is this is for the good of the climate crisis. This is, to support, work around climate justice. All these initiatives by the EU, to many of us, seem like a crafty, slick, and creative undertaking to dismantle a core principle of the Climate Convention, which is a common but differentiated responsibilities. Unable to properly dismantle CBDR within key multilateral negotiating spaces, especially from the Paris negotiations and international trade. So they have decided that since we cannot dismantle CBDR, then they've used a crafty way to be able to dismantle the responsibilities that the global north. The climate crisis is not as a result of the activities of those of us in the global south. It is not because of the smallholder farmers in Uganda or in Kenya or in Tanzania or in Mozambique. Right? We must remember why we are in a climate crisis, that Africa produces perhaps at most 6% of the emissions, yet these initiatives that label themselves as climate just, right? The EU has not undertaken deep cuts to the emissions, which are the primary cause of the climate crisis. And this is a form of outsourcing. And this is a form of weakening a very, very core principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So in conclusion, right, to call these initiatives climate just is sinister, it's diabolical, is ahistorical, and continues to add on to the already existing burdens that smallholder farmers, small businesses, medium-sized businesses face across Africa and the wider global South. It does not aid in the context of sovereignty, which African governments continue to call for, sovereignty around trade and trade relationships, rethinking and reworking of the World Trade Organization, because it's also not a neutral site. The WTO is also a site of deep inequalities across the global South, right? And the wider regulatory compliance issues around the WTO, we need to rectify historical imbalances, not simply slapping on things and calling them climate just. The historical questions must be centered. The structural support that is necessary for smallholder farmers, businesses, in the context of market access, value addition, this deep structural and systemic support have to be centered if you're going to talk about, tackling emissions, but also climate justice. So again, commitment by the EU to deep emission cuts rather than outsourcing the work to the global South, to farmers, to businesses, and to African governments and the global South governments. And of course, overall greater consideration, right, to how the EU's climate regulations and development policies might be combined, or rather need to be combined, to take into account the unique challenges and vulnerabilities faced by countries in the global South. And a lot of this, vulnerabilities are historical, and that the EU continues to benefit from the deep structural crisis, not just benefit from the structural crisis, but co-constructs and directs these historical inequalities that we face. Thank you.
Much, Ruth. Ruth is very vocal. She says the CBDR, which is the common but differential responsibilities, a principle of climate negotiations and agreements, is trying to be dismantled, and she suggests that the European Union is shifting the blame for the climate crisis away from the historical and individual responsibilities that European Union countries have to the global South. That's very powerful statements coming from Ruth there, and I'm sure the journalists have been taking note and will have an opportunity to ask questions around that. Now, I'm also going to ask the rest of the panelists to really unpack the heavy acronyms that we are using. I'll try to mention some of them. EPA, Economic Partnership Agreements. Please try to unpack. For us, I'm a journalist myself, and we really like stuff to be so easy because we want to communicate in a way that most people will easily understand. CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it is a carbon tariff. It's payment that has to be made for products that are deemed to have been created, that have been deemed to be carbon intensive. In other words, the production of a certain commodity used things like steel, cement, coal, or firewood in the production of this product. The ACFTA is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is a trade agreement between African countries. All right, let's go back to Dr. Christian. We want to talk about risks and gaps in this EU trade policy, but also...
Sorry, Mr.
Yes, Dr. Christian, can you hear me? Yes, Dr. Christian.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So my question to you is, I want to ask you about risks and gaps in the EU trade policy. But to be exact, is there any effect that this has on the EU itself? Because we've talked about the challenges that African states, especially smallholder farmers, the people that are actually producing at the ground level, are facing with this policy. But then, does the upset of the trade between the two continents affect the European Union in any way? Dr. Christian.
Okay, let's separate the products. The EU does not produce many tropical products. It does have a bit of coffee, a bit of cocoa in one of their remote areas and things like that. It used to have bananas. Now it has very little, so it can let down the ACP countries and favor the Latin American big producers like Ecuador or Colombia. But it does, the Green Deal, and that's what we're talking about today, the Green Deal does have an impact, very notable, on production costs of many, many products in the EU. So when you have steel with new obligations, if you want to produce, I call it green steel, in Europe, you have many, many obligations for your factories, okay? The same for cement. There is no green cement, but you can make it a little greener and recycle cement, all this sort of thing. Just two examples from the CBAM products, the carbon costing thing. And yes, this increases production costs of down the line, car producers, housing, whatever, right? So when these EU domestic producers get more costs upon them, they want to avoid competition from abroad of cheaper products. You can call this eco-dumping or social dumping, whatever dumping it is. Agro it is not, because EUDR does not include, CBAM does not include agriculture. But when you have this costing increase, the cost increases in the EU, immediately, of course, the interest in the EU say, well, if we have to bear the brunt, and then we cannot sell a car anymore abroad because they are benefiting from cheaper standards, then we want at least the imports into the EU being similarly taxed, tariffed, whatever. They don't call it a tax or a tariff, but that's what it is. Like, we want to have equal treatment from abroad. And this is called, in the CBAM context, it's carbon leakage, right? And carbon leakage means that a country, a competitor for cars or for cement or whatever, has in another country the possibility, should not have that possibility to export to Europe anymore at the lower prices because of lower standards. So standard harmonization we do not have, because the EU sets down its own standards, but then it applies these, I call them collateral measures. EUDR, the deforestation, and CBAM are collateral measures to avoid that the higher productions in EU will drastically reduce EU production quantities of cars, of real estate, whatever components. So for agriculture, we don't have it really in the same way, but we do have in CBAM one project, that's phosphates. And phosphates, there's one country in Africa which produces phosphates, that's Morocco. Now Morocco will have to pay CBAM for its exports of phosphate to Europe, but it can of course choose to not export to Europe, but to neighboring African countries. Whether that's the same price or not is another question, but Morocco will not lose market access totally. It can even increase intra-African trade if we have comparable standards and things like that. And then that's what I call the painful choice for operators, for governments, for CSO, to how do we restructure our debate, our production, our value chains, food and non-food. And this is something which can be very painful. For coffee, you don't compete with European producers, but you compete with a non-European, the big coffee guys, starting in Ethiopia, actually, but also the biggest exporters now are countries like Vietnam. Nobody knows that, but Vietnam has moved up beyond Colombia, which is number 2, or just after Colombia. So what do you do with the processors, with the roasters, when your own coffee is getting competition from countries like Vietnam? In Vietnam, the government and my university colleagues, they say we don't want labor restrictions. We want any job. We don't want better jobs. That's the one thing which ILO never got the labor organization of the UN, never got across. They want better jobs and more jobs. And a country like Vietnam says that's not possible, and we prefer more jobs. We are able to work any number of hours and days a week to beat the Chinese, for instance, for garment production and chips production. So you have an impact on African producers, direct for non-tropical products, but also indirect for competition from other countries outside Africa and outside Europe. Did I answer your question?
Now, I'm going to bring in Ashley to talk about opportunities. I know she really wanted to talk about opportunities, but I think this is the time now to talk if there are any opportunities, or is it gloom and doom for all of us here in the Global South when it comes to the EU sustainability regulations?
Well, I don't think it's all gloom and doom, although I don't have significant, I think my position politically is very similar to what Ruth and Christian have outlined. And I think that we are in that reality. And at the same time, we have to recognize that if we delay, if we ignore that these directives are here, then indeed there can be a choice, like Christian says, there can be a hard choice to change trade routes and to work with other partners and prioritize other partners. And that will inevitably leave smallholders and your local exporters left out, marginalized, and again, not losing market access entirely, but less valuable, less reliable markets. So I'm coming from a position where we are recognizing that the EUDR is moving forward and these other directives are moving forward at the same time as this inequality exists and this historical context exists. So I'm not dismissing any of that, but I do see, we do see several different opportunities that can be taken advantage of here. If we focus on, let's say, the EUDR directive, the European Union Deforestation Regulation, we see that the EUDR says that we need to show that all the products have not been grown on land that are deforested after 2020. That's one requirement. Another requirement is that they are produced in accordance with local regulations. And the third is that they must be traceable back to the farm. Now, there are significant opportunities related to 2 out of 3 of these elements of the directive. If African states, either individually or regionally, want to take up the opportunity, then this is a great opportunity actually to align local regulations, be it around natural resource use, land tenure, data ownership and management, land use policy. These elements, this is a real opportunity for individual African states or regions to work together to align one's own policies in the Afrocentric direction that you would like to see, and then bring that into the context of the EUDR to showcase that these are your local regulations and you are able to implement them accordingly. This, I would say, from a perspective on farmers, this enables farmers, if there is investment and focus on compliance, what this can do for farmers and local supply chain actors is actually make them more digitalized and market ready. It also allows them to be less reliant on multinationals and more independent from a supply chain approach. If there's real investment in ensuring smallholders and other actors can comply, so then they can ensure that they can keep getting the markets on their own terms. At national level, as well as local actor level, but especially national level, there are real opportunities related to data ownership, management, and insights. I find this to be often not discussed or a little bit ignored. Part of the downside of the EUDR directive related to traceability and the accumulation of power and information of multinationals is that multinationals already were collecting a lot of information and had a lot of data and information that they can use to better their own business practice. And unfortunately, since they are the major investors here, they are consolidating their power related to data ownership, information, and access related to production systems as well as traceability. But this does not have to be the case. This can be organized at a national level with local government and or decentralized among other local actors. Yes, the resources need to be available from the EU and other partners, but also guided by local governments. So there's a real opportunity for better data management and better understanding of what's going on locally and empowerment of local actors. I'll keep it short on land use policy and land tenure, but there are also some real opportunities here to organize local industry as well as development, pro-port development approaches and other Afrocentric development approaches locally, and then have that guide actually land use and land tenure, which will influence how the EUDR sees compliance. I think these are a few opportunities. We've also seen really practically related to the EU cocoa talks, as well as in some East Africa coffee contexts, that there is quite some institutional collaboration at national level, as well as across public, private, and civil society. This can only help all actors, because when we bring the multinationals with the local actors, as well as policymakers, and the voices of smallholders and others, we can only move forward together rather than excluding. So there's a real opportunity to take advantage here.
Ashley. Mr. Rangarirai Machemedze, the coordinator for Siatini Southern Africa, is here. Welcome. Please say hello to our listeners before I give you my question to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, colleagues. As you have heard, my name is Rangarai Machemedze from Siatini, Southern Africa, and I'm looking forward to massive discussions around these very critical directives. Thank you so much.
With regard to this EU policy on trade.
Thank you so much. I've had the privilege to listen to all the speakers when the meeting started. I was actually their chair. When you said I would join later, I was actually there. So thank you so much. Now, with respect to the question that you have asked, I think one of the critical things that we need to understand is that if you look at the EU directives, whilst they are framed as tools, for example, for environmental sustainability and accountability, in terms of regional integration, they actually risk becoming non-tariff barriers that affect exporters, especially what I heard from Ashley and the other colleagues, smallholder farmers, the SMEs, and obviously our countries as resource-based countries. Now, for the benefit of the meeting, the non-tariff barriers, they are basically trade restrictions that do not involve tariffs. As you know, we are in an era where we are negotiating the so-called free trade agreements, like the economic partnership agreements that have been talked about, the African Continental Free Trade Area that we're talking about. These are focused at dismantling the tariffs that exist that should not restrict trade. However, when you look at the EU directives, they are now becoming non-tariff barriers. Because when you look at non-tariff barriers, these are restrictions that really look at technical regulations, things to do with sanitary and phytosanitary standards, things to do with certification and labeling requirements, and of course, the environmental compliance mandates that we are looking at. Now, if you look at the different industries within the regions that we have, either EAC or SADC or COMESA, you will find that we do not have the institutional capacities that have been developed, for example, for digital traceability systems that the earlier colleagues were talking about, or to account for, the carbon emissions, the tools we do not have, or perhaps even the third-party certification We do not have those. So when you look at this from this perspective, the EU directive, they are actually becoming non-tariff barriers because of the lack of institutional capacities from our countries to be able to implement these. Now, if you look at it from a bigger picture perspective, and I like the Ruth's historical legacy that she talked about. If you look at it, the European Commission's own research, it actually says the non-tariff barriers, they increase the cost of African trade by up to 283% more than tariffs. Directives, they risk undermining Africa's export-led growth, especially in sectors like agriculture, in forestry, or even in biofuels that other countries are mostly involved in. So this is not just a technical challenge that we have at regional level, but it is actually becoming a structural injustice that you have. Now, I want to link this structural injustice to the colonial legacy and the burden of compliance region. Now, we must understand the fact that EU's trade relationship with Africa is shaped by this legacy, which has left many African countries institutionally weak and also economically dependent. You will find that during the period of colonialism, the laws, the legal systems, the frameworks, the regulations that were in place, they were designed for extraction and not for development. And if you look at it, look at Uganda right now, look at Zimbabwe right now, look at many African countries right now. The legal system, if you look at the laws that are still in existence, these are the laws that were promulgated way back in the 1950s. And these are the laws that were promoting extraction and extractivism. And we still have these laws. They haven't been changed. And because of that, post-independence, if you look at the post-independence period, we African countries have inherited these fragmented legal systems and economies, which continue to tether to European markets. So today we are being asked to comply with complex sustainability directives without the institutional foundations to do so. So this dynamic, if you look at it, even from a regional perspective, it actually shows what many have actually said. We are going into a period of unintentional neo-colonialism, where African trade is shaped more by European priorities rather than African agency. So the so-called made in Brussels solutions are presented as universal, while African realities are actually sidelined. The CBAM that has been talked about, for example, it actually is a testament to that. So we are penalized for not having institutions. We were never allowed to build in the first place. We are excluded from markets for failing to meet standards which we had no role in designing. So if you look, for example, at the economic partnership agreements, at the EAC level or at the SADC level, these agreements were originally designed to promote reciprocal trade with the EU, but they now face a new layer of complexity with regards to EU sustainability directives. So we have to renegotiate, given this situation, we have to renegotiate in terms of regional integration. We have to renegotiate the EPA terms to include, for example, flexibility clauses or transitional periods for us to be able to comply. That will be critical, special, and differential treatment. And not to comply now, but the need for transitional periods to be able to do that. But most importantly, also, technical support mechanisms are required, whether in terms of the financial resources or in terms of building institutional capacities for these technical standards, because we do not have these institutional capacities. So we have our own, obviously, protocols at the regional level that we can leverage as platforms for regional coordination, but there is need for regional coordination within the precincts of the African Continental Free Trade Area, within the precincts of the East African Community, COMESA and SADC. And I'm happy to say last year we saw COMESA EAC, and SADC coming together to form a tripartite free trade area. So these are the areas that are supposed now to come up with perhaps coordinated efforts to respond to the EU sustainability directives. And once we are able to do that, then at that regional level, we should be able to develop and invest in green certification systems, in digital traceability platforms, in regional carbon accounting frameworks, in capacity building for SMEs and farmers. Now, even if we are able to do this, we are actually following the directives of the EU, but we have to do it from our own perspective, from our own regional realities, from our own contextual and developmental realities, and not to
point, Mr. Rangarirai.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. I want to bring in Ruth before we open the floor for questions from the journalists and the audience. Ruth, we are working around the theme of equitable, transformative, and mutually beneficial. What is your solution to some of the challenges that you raised with regard to this EU trade policy with Africa and the Global South? And how do you think that these solutions can be implemented? And do you think that it is within the powers of the powers that be between African states and the European Union to actually fix the challenges that you raised?
I'm struggling to be an optimist, but it seems like we live in a very pessimistic world at the current moment. So I'll try my best to be very optimistic. And again, building on what the previous speakers have spoken about, one of the things, and I'd mentioned it earlier, is that Africa needs to get very serious about the politics of sovereignty. Nobody's coming to save us. Nobody is coming to save the continent of Africa. And if I should trespass a little bit in terms of this conversation, and just to see how, for example, even the tariff debates between the US and the China, how radically different they look, is because China has managed to figure out a politics of sovereignty that most of us across the world and largely across the global South have not yet gotten to. So that's the first thing, a question around sovereignty. The previous speaker has spoken about the tripartite trade space within COMESA, SADC, and the EAC. We need to reclaim this radical ideas around regionalism and integration. There is no radical politics that Kenya does on its own in terms of negotiations with the EU, or Uganda does alone. We really need to make the EAC work. We need to make COMESA work. We need to get SADC to work. We need to get ECOWAS to work, but then also work collectively as a continent, and also work in the context of a Pan-African radical politics of development, because trade questions are development questions at the end of the day. Again, going back to what I said, the fact that this continent has about only 3% of the manufacturing share globally, a statistic that irritates me and annoys me every single time I have to think about it. Yet the majority of the resources that are used to produce, whether it's Levi's jeans, which are produced in special economic zones in Kenya, with workers earning slave-like, salaries and conditions, whether it's cocoa with children working as, agricultural labor. We need to figure out a politics of sovereignty, but recover a politics of regionalism that actually works for the continent of Africa. The second thing, and I think that ties into the first, politics of sovereignty. That is the only way we are able to then address or redress the historical imbalances around trade that follow us from the colonial enterprise or the colonial period. The legacies of colonialism, which morph into neoliberal globalization, and what we have in the context of a continent where the state largely does not function, where it is the private sector. We are told that we can entrepreneur ourselves out of poverty. But the honest truth is this: we need a strong functioning state across the continent of Africa. State as an individual entity, whether it's Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. But again, right, the Pan-African idea around what are functioning states, right? That is the only way we are able to structurally address the historical questions around trade, but also trade amongst ourselves, right? This idea that we have to export, that Africa has to continue being a site of, when you go through, Samir Amin, the late Egyptian economist, talked about dependency and, unequal exchange, that Africa has to continue being a site where raw materials are taken out under very exploitative means to go to the global north. Yet, we could trade amongst each other. We need to figure out a trading bloc across the continent of Africa, not just sitting and thinking that the only thing that we can do in the context of trade is send our things, send our resources, and even send our labor increasingly to the global north. We have to figure out trade for this continent. And I guess a final thing for me in terms of solutions, but also redress. I will say this because my own, not just intellectual work, but activist work started within the climate justice movement. The European Union, the global north, I will not stop saying this, is responsible for the climate crisis. They must be at the front line of dealing with emissions, dealing with their historical responsibilities. They cannot be outsourced. They cannot be outsourced through tariffs or non-tariff barriers. They cannot be outsourced by climate finance that is largely in the context of loans, not even grants, but also not in the context of reparations, which is what, and especially this year, this is the African Union year of reparations for us on the continent of Africa. Climate finance must be in the form of reparations, must be in the form of grants, not in the form of loans, to further, not loans that further, add on to the inequalities that we face as a continent, right? So for me, ultimately, we can go back and forth around this, a politics of sovereignty, a politics around thinking about what do we think about trade in a liberatory and emancipatory form around the continent of Africa as a trade bloc for the 55 countries that are in Africa. But importantly, the climate crisis, we cannot weaken CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. And it cannot be outsourced to those of us, not just in Africa, but the wider global South and the wider global majority. The cause of this crisis must be named and must be addressed in ways that are equitable, in ways that are just, in ways that do not continue to burden those on the front lines of the climate crisis, smallholder farmers, informal traders, small and medium-sized enterprises. It cannot. The real cause of the climate crisis must be addressed.
Now, we have chat box on Zoom, so please write your questions. For the journalists and the audience, write your question in the chat box, and we'll put those questions to the panelists while they're here. I think I should have told you this earlier, but we'll take first come, first serve. So whoever writes first will get their questions answered first. So write in the chat box, but I think I should be able to also take a few questions via audio if my producers allow me to do that. But also I'm going to ask one of the producers here to print out those messages when they come through, so we can read those that have written in the chat box, but also for those that are available and have requested for the mic, let's give them a microphone. But right after I hear from Mr. Rangarirai, I stopped you in the middle of your train of thoughts, and that was by design, so you can have the final say, since we kind of skipped you, unfortunately, because the producers had told me that you were to join later. But now that you are here, we are going to make our lemonade out of these lemons. So you can tell us more about your recommendations for our governments in Africa, but also recommendations to the European Union, because I'm sure that the European Union also has the power and the ability to make changes because we do know that laws and policies are not cast in stone. They are dynamic. They can be amended. They can be changed to fit the dictates of the times. So, go ahead, Ranga.
No, thank you so much. This is really important and critical. And my recommendations, particularly for Africa, is number one, we need to work in harmony in terms of regional integration, because this is really critical. If you look at the EU, they are not working as individual countries, but they are working as a region, a united region with 27 countries that have developed technical abilities, technical capacities, have got institutions. Now, individually, as African countries, we cannot match the EU juggernaut in this. So there is need for regional cooperation and regional integration, particularly to harmonize our standards across the different member states. But for us to be able to do that, we need to conduct national impact assessments of these green directives, especially to look at what institutional capacities do we have at individual member states that could be aggregated into regional institutions that are strong enough to be able to service the interests of African countries first, before we service the interests of external trade partners like the European Union. So that's one. And then secondly, once we have these institutional capacities in place, we should then be in a position to negotiate strongly with the EU and other external partners. We must not lose sight of the fact that these directives and what is happening elsewhere, these things, they are actually going to stay. They are not going to go away. So we need to negotiate for transitional periods and technical assistance in this regard, because most of the EU institutions, they have developed their capacities over a long period of time. They have got the historical legacy on that, which we can tap into. Let us take advantage of the relations that we have to build our technical capacities and get the technical assistance that is required. That is, if these are going to be embedded already in the reciprocal trade arrangements that we have, then we must demand, in terms of negotiations, we must demand that there has to be technical resources to support this. Because at the end of the day, we do have the resources. Although we are not value adding them, we do have the resources that the EU countries require. Look at the critical minerals, for example. We do have these resources. And without the EU investing strongly in building institutional capacities, then we should be able to come up with a policy that will not allow these resources to be exported. I mean, we just need to stand our ground as African countries, but we cannot do this individually. There is need for this coalition. There is need for this regional cooperation and regional integration. Of course, there is no doubt that we also need to invest in the infrastructure that is required. It could be the green infrastructure and even the certification bodies. We need to do that because this is not only for the EU, but we must also do it for ourselves. We also need standards within our own territories, standards that respond to quality issues, where our citizens must also have access to quality products that meet certain standards. So we are doing this for ourselves as well. So at the end of the day, regional platforms that we have, the East African Community, SADC, COMESA that we have, these platforms must also offer some kind of training in compliance, in data sharing, and provide policy space for the different constituencies to come together to discuss these issues. It could be the farmers, it could be the SMEs. We need that space to be able to do that. So in conclusion, Africa must not be a passive recipient of external sustainability mandates. And this I have to emphasize. We cannot be passive recipients of external sustainability mandates. We must shape the rules, not just to follow them. We must assert our trade policy space, especially by confronting the historical inequities and injustices that we have experienced over a long period of time. And now it's being institutionalized again for Africa to remain underdeveloped, because we will for sure remain underdeveloped if we fail to meet some of this. So we must be able to confront these historical injustices and invest in regional preparedness, where we can turn the seemingly difficult situation into a good situation for us as African countries. So this is my response to the question that you have asked, and I hope we should be able to come up with strong policy recommendations that our governments will be able to adopt and implement at the national and the regional levels.
Ranga. Now, let me read some of our questions here. We have Ruth Bagan from Transform Trade UK, who says, greetings from Transform Trade UK, Jane. You are also an expert, she said. We have benefited from your expertise over so many years. Ventura Mufume would like to learn more from what Dr. Christian just said about ILO's call for better or decent jobs versus countries' emphasis on better jobs. There's also a conversation there between Dr. Christian and Ashley. Christian says, thanks for the question. It's too long for a chat. In short, there is an inherent conflict between better and more jobs. The ILO's famous tripartite structure never allowed a debate or a recommendation or a resolution. So these texts, just as I'm reading them, are on the chat, so you can go and read them. Ashley Tattleman, I did not have the opportunity to speak on the opportunity around EU tariff elimination that enables value addition within Africa, and hence an opportunity to retain more value or equity in the supply chain and reduce risks. VOCA member Coffee Watch, there's a VOCA member called Coffee Watch that has recently published research on value-added coffee tariffs for EU imports. So opportunities exist to use relevant historical and structural arguments shared by co-panelists alongside the limited resourcing from EU to EU directives transition to negotiate for better trade terms. She also added a link to that paper of Coffee Watch. If you need to read more, just click on that link. It's right there in the chat box. Ruth continues to ask, Ruth Bagan from Transform Trade UK, do the panelists, maybe for Ashley, I think the question is directly to Ashley, do you have recommendations for how to ensure smallholder farmers have more urgency in the development of deforestation and other green regulations, and their needs are prioritized? I'm thinking key messages for companies as well as governments. There's your question, Ashley. Yodit Tefera, what efforts is the EU making to ensure that the carbon credit finances actually go to the smallholder farmers that are struggling to meet EU standards and not in the pockets of corrupt governments of Africa? What is the EU doing to strengthen the various regional trade entities, and does it support them to become strong? I don't know who's going to take this one. Who wants to take this question on? Any of my panelists? Who?
They can.
I can.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
That's
Yeah, I just.
Oh,
Yes,
oh,
that
yes.
is just.
Okay.
All right. I just.
Let me just read the last question. Last question, and then you can take those. So we have one for Ashley, one for taken by Ruth, and then one for Christian by Ventura Mufume, who says, I would like Christian's views on how the ILO's employment policy role has impacted Mozambique or other SADC countries, particularly regarding the better jobs versus more jobs debate. Ventura Mufume is from Mozambique. He had written earlier at around 10 a.m. when we started, introducing himself Ventura Mukume from Mozambique. So let's have those answers. We'll take very short time. I think I'll give just 2 minutes for each answer to the questions before we can hear from Ms. Jane Nalunga and also talking about the joint press statement, which we are going to be releasing after this press conference. Go ahead. We'll start with you, Ashley, then Ruth, and then Dr. Christian, in that order.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the questions. Specifically, the question I'm answering is about ensuring smallholders are having agency in the development of these directives and how they can be prioritized. There's 3 key areas that I see, or probably 4, which all have to do with the integration of smallholder voices and their priorities at different layers. One is at the EU level. So the EU policymakers need to be exposed to smallholder farmers through reports of partners and others on the ground working directly with smallholders, and also to engage with them directly. Now, several of the Vocal Member Network members are actually bringing smallholders and indigenous folks and others from a range of origins in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to Brussels to speak to policymakers to reflect on the smallholder circumstance. The other 2 relate to more the origin context. It's clear that local and national governments in each country and region need to also prioritize consulting directly with their own constituents, their own citizens and producers, so that they can ensure that their priorities are also in line with the smallholder context. Third is actually creating more space for civil society to exist across different origin governments. We see that in West Africa for cocoa, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, as well as in Uganda for coffee, that actually the presence of civil society members and a robust civil society that links to smallholders as well as to industry and government have enabled more smallholders to be included and to be reached during this transition process. So I think ensuring that farmers' voices are directly heard and represented are important. Now, for myself as a human-centered designer, I really believe that all solutions need to be built alongside and with their end users. So this is, we're a little bit late on the EU directives element, but it's always helpful to test directly the systems and structures that we're setting in place to see how they are going to affect those that are most marginalized or potentially will be marginalized and excluded. So we definitely would like to see better design there. And there are multiple ways in which that can be brought to life. But I think that is my 2 minutes. So thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. Ruth, in 2 minutes.
Okay, I will just say this. I think we need to be very careful about carbon markets itself. Very many movements across the continent of Africa reject carbon markets. They're seen as false solutions to the climate crisis, but also the incentives that carbon markets continue to give corporations, mostly based in the global north, to continue polluting and thus continue emissions and ultimately outsourcing the crisis. And again, the fact that a lot of they're largely within the voluntary carbon markets rather than compliance markets like the ETS. So I'd say that a lot of caution needs to be taken around carbon markets and to speak to actual movements and communities across the continent of Africa who have been evicted from their land, who have been killed, who have had to face paramilitaries and the police in order for the market mechanisms to actually function. So I'd say a lot of caution needs to be taken around that and to actually speak to movements and communities and those of us who have documented the crisis around carbon markets across the continent of Africa and the wider global south.
Let's hear from Dr. Christian for 2 minutes with an answer to Ventura Mukume's question.
Very quickly, I did answer something already. I should add that Mozambique and SADC, I think, cannot benefit from ILO conventions, not only because they don't ratify them, but also because trade unions prefer, sadly to say, employees to job seekers. But, and the golden view there is that even though now we have migration which prevails over jobs, and that's getting other types of problems we cannot talk about this morning, South African migration. The golden way is, I think, in ECOWAS, which did have conventions how to normalize standards for certain service providers. And when those standards are regionally regionalized, then you have a better possibility for intra-West African labor migration, trade migration. That's the end. I would like later to speak more about standard Pan-African standards. Thank you.
Very much. I'm now going to welcome Ms. Jane Nalunga to give us a summary of these reflections, but also to talk about the press statement which we are going to be releasing. We've had quite an interesting debate here with the panel discussion, but now we want to hear from you to wrap it all up, because you started, you gave us the foundation that we have built this whole conversation on, and I want to see where this conversation has reached, and the recommendations that have been given by the panel, and also the questions that the press has given. What are those things that, if we were to forget everything that we have spoken about here, what shouldn't we forget?
That's a very tall order, but I would like to thank our panelists. That has been really, really incredible. We are going to write out a report, but there are really lots of ideas really coming up, and very critical ideas regarding the way forward. But before I give one or two points, key points, which are coming up, which have come up, I would like to recognize Francisco. Thank you so much for joining. Francisco is from Bread for the World. Thank you so much for being on this conversation, and I think we can carry it forward. A number of these issues we are working on, we are part of the MATS, a consortium, the Making Agriculture Trade Sustainable. It was a project, very, very interesting project, and we did a lot of research. Professor Bodo hasn't been able to be here. And also Professor Christian. We have been working together, and other people on this project, and there are a lot of research. So please go to MATS. The studies are there. It's really difficult to say what we can't forget, but one issue which is coming out clearly, that these EU directives, we need to question whether they are really value for money when it comes to addressing the climate crisis, or are they really, mechanisms like carbon trading and all that? It's like we are veering away from addressing the actual issue of reducing the emissions. But if they are being implemented, they should not be implemented as a one size fit all. But what's really interesting are three issues. One, Ranga pointed out that the directives are not going to go away. They are not going to go away. We can request and negotiate for transition periods, but they are not going to go away because they are already being negotiated in the EPAs. I had requested Daniel to give Rand some time to talk about the EPAs, but the time factor is a problem. So we are negotiating free trade agreements, and those same issues are there. They are not going to go away. But we go back to the issue which Christian has raised, of he called it the painful choices, looking forward, alternatives, scanning the environment, looking at the alternative markets, looking at our competitors, Vietnam. He called that painful choices. They might not be painful, but I think it's really important what next? You know, we need to look at that. And when we are looking at what next, we need to look at the issues which my sister Nyambura has raised and Ranga, you know, that we are not, the canvas is not clean. It's not a clean slate. We have all this backlog of neoliberal policies, weak institutions as a result of the structure adjustment programs. And that's why government is incapacitated to do what it's supposed to do. You know, so when we are looking at those painful choices, we need to remember that the slate is not clean. And I liked the example that actually gave comparing Uganda to Rwanda. And for Uganda, the issue is that we implemented the structural adjustment program 100%, and we haven't gone back. Yet Rwanda has been able to address some of the challenges. So when you look at what actually pointed out, that Rwanda has been able to address some of the challenges of the EU directives because they are organized. Yet Uganda, we are liberalized. We are looking at where we are coming from, the issues of structure adjustment programs and those neo-colonial institutional policies. So I liked the way the presentation merged together. But looking forward, everybody talked about the issue of, Nyambura raised the issue of politics of sovereignty. And Rang emphasized the issue of regionalization, regionalism, strengthening our regional integration, the tripartite, the CFTA. But the issue is, how do we do it? Because what's happening today on the ground, we are negotiating differently. The EPAs in the East African region, Kenya has already signed the EPA. And when you look at the EPA, there are things like export taxes. Don't put export taxes. Yet we are talking about, my sister Nyambura, you want to about the 3% manufacturing. How do you manufacture when you're allowing things to go out? So we need to rethink. And lastly, Ashley talked about opportunities. We need to consider these opportunities. And for me, the biggest opportunity is about EUDR. And what I have got from this conversation is that it's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call to make what Christian has talked about, the painful choices. Thank you so much. Thank you, our listeners. Thank you, our presenters. It has been really, really wonderful. And the fourth estate, I hope you can be able to use these issues to publicize them more and put them in the public domain for further debate. Our next action, we are going to put together all this debate and conversation in a statement, and we are going to finalize it. But we are also calling upon our fellow civil society members here. Let us have more debate around these issues. Let us organize more conversations so that we can be able to chart a way forward. And let us make them multi-sectoral. Let us make sure our policymakers, our negotiators, the CFTA, the regional bodies are also on board. You know. So thank you. Thank you so much. I will end there.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Jane Nalunga, the Executive Director of the Southern Eastern African Trade and Southern East African Trade and Information and Negotiation Institute, CIATINI. We also had Ruth Nyambura, who is a feminist, an activist, scholar, and convener of the Ramani Collective. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Christian Habad is a fellow at the World Trade Institute at the University of Bern and a consultant for scientific research and outreach activities in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Mr. Rangarirai Machemedze is the coordinator for CIATINI, Southern Africa. And we also had Ashley Tattleman, the Global Coffee lead at Vocal, the voice of organizations in Coffee Alliance Network. And my name is Daniel Lutaya. Now, for the press release, the same portal or platform where you saw the link to this Zoom link, the link for this Zoom call rather, will be used to disseminate the press release when it comes. And for press questions, I would refer you to send an email to Siatini. Go to the Siatini website on Twitter, on Facebook, and all the social media platforms, and get in touch with Siatini if you have any further questions. But also, I would recommend and encourage the panelists, if you can, to share a press email, an email from your office, where journalists can direct any further questions that they may have regarding this issue. And if you fail to get any of the panelists directly, please reach out to Siatini, and they'll be able to give you information about any questions that you may have regarding the EU and Africa's trade policy. My name is Daniel Lutaya. I would like to thank all of you for joining us. We have overshot our time by 1 minute, and please accept my humble apologies for taking all of that time from you. From all of us here in Kampala, it's a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are listening to us from. It could be morning, it could be afternoon, it could be evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It has been really, really good conversation.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to overshoot the time.
Thank you so much.
Everybody,